What does AI actually look like in 2050? Not according to tech founders, not according to sci-fi writers, but according to the hardest institutional data available right now. McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, the World Economic Forum, the OECD. We went through every major forecast we could find. And honestly, what came back was not what we expected. This is not a hype video. No speculation. No agenda. Just verified numbers, and what they actually imply. But here's the thing that caught us off guard immediately. Some of these numbers directly contradict each other. And that contradiction? It's more revealing than either number alone. So let's start with the one number that changes how you read everything else. In 2023, Goldman Sachs estimated that generative AI could add $7 trillion to global GDP within a decade. $7 trillion. Larger than the entire economies of Germany and Japan combined. That number sat with us for a while. Because it sounds like an unambiguous win, until you read the next page of the same report. So why aren't economists celebrating? Because on that next page is a second number. 300 million jobs globally exposed to automation. Exposed, meaning the core tasks within those roles can already be replicated by AI at current capability levels. Not eliminated overnight, but fundamentally changed. And that distinction matters enormously. Same report. Same authors. $7 trillion gained. 300 million jobs fundamentally restructured. Both sitting on the same page. Both true simultaneously. Think about what that actually means for a second. Let's make it concrete. Picture someone we'll call Marcus. Mid-level financial analyst. 10 years of experience. Good at his job. He spent 3 years getting a finance degree, 2 more getting certified, and the last decade building the kind of analytical judgment that takes real time to develop. He reviews loan portfolios, models risk, produces reports that senior partners use to make decisions worth millions of dollars. Marcus is not worried about AI. Because Marcus does cognitively demanding work. Skilled work. The kind of work that requires a human brain. And according to the Goldman Sachs report sitting open on our screen right now, Marcus is exactly the profile this data is describing. Routine financial analysis. Standard modeling. Report generation. These are not physical tasks. They are not low-skill tasks. They are precisely the cognitive tasks that current AI systems are most capable of replicating, and in many cases already are. Marcus isn't a hypothetical. There are millions of people in roles structured exactly like his, in law firms, in accounting departments, in analyst pools at banks in London, Sydney, Toronto, and New York, who have built careers on the assumption that cognitive complexity equals job security. That assumption needs to be examined carefully. And that's exactly what this video is built to help you do. This isn't a case of optimists versus pessimists reading the same data differently. This is one institution, in one report, holding both realities at once, and not resolving the tension between them. Because the data doesn't resolve it. And that is the most important thing to understand before we go any further. But here's what made this even harder to dismiss. That same tension doesn't just live in Goldman Sachs. It shows up in McKinsey's models. It shows up in WEF data. It shows up in IMF research published just months ago. Every major institution looking seriously at AI in 2050 is sitting with the same uncomfortable split, enormous aggregate gain, and that gain not reaching everyone equally. Not even close. Different outcomes across economies, across income levels, across geographies. The same technology, producing wildly different results depending on where you sit. And the data gets far more specific from here. The World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, and this number genuinely surprised us, projects 69 million new roles created by technology by 2027. And 83 million displaced in the exact same window. Net loss of 14 million jobs. In just 3 years. Now extend that same modeling framework out to 2050, and the numbers McKinsey produces when you stretch that model to its full timeline reframe the entire conversation. So what does McKinsey actually find when you stop at 2030 and keep going, all the way to 2050? Because here's the problem with most coverage: it grabs the nearest number, puts it in a headline, and stops there. The 2027 figure. The 2030 estimate. Done. But that's not the story. That's just the beginning of it. Everything in this video comes from primary institutional research, the full reports, not the press releases. The complete McKinsey modeling, not the summary slide. The actual Goldman analysis, not the coverage of it. And critically, not just where these institutions agree, but where they diverge. Because the gaps between their conclusions are often more revealing than the conclusions themselves. Here's what the actual modeling says. McKinsey's modeling puts between 400 and 800 million workers globally in a position where they won't just need new skills by 2030, they'll need entirely new occupations. Not a career pivot. A career replacement. And that's before we even get to 2050. That range, 400 to 800 million, is deliberately wide. And most people read that width as a weakness in the research. It isn't. The range is wide because the outcome depends on variables that haven't been decided yet. And that's the data being honest with you, which most headlines aren't. So what are those variables? How fast AI actually gets adopted? Whether the infrastructure exists to support it? And what regulators in each major economy decide to do about it, which right now is genuinely anyone's guess. Change any one of those significantly, and the projection shifts by hundreds of millions of people. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a manageable labor transition and a structural crisis. And right now, none of those three variables are locked in. Which means the future of work under AI is still being written. Right now. By decisions that haven't been finalized yet. And that should change how you read every AI forecast going forward. But here's where McKinsey's research gets more specific, and where it cuts directly against the assumption most professionals make about their own position. Because when you break down which jobs are most exposed versus least exposed, the pattern is not what most people expect. Most people assume physical labor is most at risk. The data says otherwise. The jobs flagged as least exposed are roles requiring complex physical dexterity in unpredictable environments, skilled trades, care roles, hands-on technical work. The jobs most exposed? Routine cognitive tasks, data processing, standard legal analysis, basic financial modeling, entry-level coding, administrative functions across every sector. That list, data processing, financial modeling, standard legal analysis, is not a description of low-skill work. It is a description of Marcus's week. Sit with that for a second. The roles most at risk are not the ones historically associated with automation. They are white-collar, cognitively demanding roles that entire generations of professionals were told were safe, precisely because they required thinking. The data is now telling a different story. And if you assumed your role was insulated because it requires a degree or analytical skill, the OECD's 2023 employment outlook is worth sitting with carefully. It found that 27% of jobs in OECD countries are at high risk of automation. But context matters enormously here, because in 2013, the widely cited Oxford study by Fry and Osborne put that same figure at 47%. A decade of better data, more refined models, real-world AI deployment, and the estimate dropped by nearly half. Now before you take that as good news and move on, don't. Because that drop from 47% to 27% has nothing to do with AI becoming less capable. If anything, AI got dramatically more capable in that same decade. What actually changed was the quality of the question being asked. Earlier models looked at jobs as whole units. This job is at risk, that one isn't. The newer research looks inside the job. Which specific tasks does this role actually involve? Which of those tasks can AI already do? That shift in methodology produces a completely different picture. And honestly a more unsettling one, because it means almost no role is fully safe. It's just a question of how much of it is exposed. And that distinction, between a role being exposed and a role being eliminated, is real and it matters. But it only matters if you understand which parts of your role are actually at risk. Not panicked over. Examined. That's what the data is asking you to do. Because a job that is 40% automatable is not a job that disappears. What actually happens to a job that's 40% automatable? It doesn't vanish. It changes shape. Sometimes the person in that role moves into higher value work as AI handles the routine parts. Sometimes the team shrinks because 3 people's worth of output now comes from 1 person plus AI. Sometimes the role disappears entirely, and something new takes its place that nobody had a name for 5 years ago. And here's the thing, all 3 of those outcomes are already happening. Right now. Across different industries simultaneously. It's not a future scenario. It's the current one. No sector untouched. Not one. And yet, this is the part that gets consistently buried. The data also shows something that complicates the pure displacement narrative entirely. Steam power wiped out entire trades. Electricity restructured manufacturing completely. The internet killed industries nobody thought were vulnerable. And every single time, the net job count went up. New industries. New roles. Things nobody saw coming. That's the historical pattern. So is AI different this time? That question is not rhetorical. It is not unanswered because we haven't looked hard enough. It is unanswered because the economists who have spent their entire careers studying general-purpose technology transitions, people who have looked at this longer and more rigorously than anyone, are genuinely split. Not at the fringes of the debate. At the center of it. The historical pattern says more jobs come out the other side. The speed and breadth of AI says this time the pattern may not hold. Both positions have serious institutional backing. Neither has won the argument. And here is the thing about that unresolved debate that most coverage completely misses. The fact that it is genuinely unresolved, at the institutional level, among the most credible researchers in the field, using the best data available, is not a gap in our knowledge. It is a finding. It tells you that we are inside a transition whose outcome is still being determined. Not predicted. Determined. By decisions being made right now. Which means the question of whether AI is different this time is not a question anyone can answer for you. It is a question the next decade of structural choices will answer for all of us. That is what makes the economic output projections matter as much as they do. And that is exactly where we are going next. What comes next reframes everything above it. The labor numbers, the displacement projections, the McKinsey modeling, all of it sits inside a larger economic picture that most coverage never reaches. Because the numbers in this next section are where the real scale of what's at stake finally becomes visible. And once you see it at that scale, the earlier data reads completely differently. Now let's talk about the number that makes everything else feel small. PwC's 2017 report, still one of the most comprehensive macro-level AI projections ever published, estimated that AI could contribute up to $15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. Not over a century. By 2030. And when you extend that modeling framework out to 2050, the projections from multiple institutions start producing numbers that are genuinely difficult to put in context. Some models suggest AI's contribution to global GDP by 2050 could land somewhere between 10% and 40% of total global output. That range is enormous. And the gap between 10% and 40% is not a minor modeling disagreement. It is the difference between AI being one of the most significant economic forces in modern history, and AI being the defining economic force of the entire century. Both outcomes are sitting inside credible institutional research right now. And the variable that determines which one we get is not AI capability. AI capability, at this point, is almost beside the point. The variable is adoption. And adoption is where the data gets genuinely complicated. Here's something most economic coverage of AI gets completely wrong. The assumption embedded in most headline projections is that powerful technology equals immediate productivity gain. It doesn't. It never has. And the historical evidence on this is so consistent it has its own name in economics literature, the productivity paradox. Erik Brynjolfsson at Stanford has been mapping this dynamic for decades. His 2021 paper, The Turing Trap, published in Daedalus, argues that general-purpose technologies almost never produce the productivity gains economists expect on the timeline economists expect. The gains are real, but they're slow, and they're uneven, and they require a restructuring of entire systems, not just the adoption of a new tool, before they show up meaningfully in output numbers. The analogy every serious economist keeps returning to is electrification. When electricity became widely available in the late 19th century, economists expected an immediate productivity surge. It didn't come. And the reason why is something almost nobody talks about when they cite this analogy. For decades, factories kept their old layouts, their old workflows, their old management structures, just with electric motors replacing steam ones. The productivity gains only materialized when entire production systems were redesigned around what electricity actually made possible. That restructuring took 30 to 40 years. 30 to 40 years. Let that land. Because if the same dynamic applies to AI, and Brynjolfsson's research suggests it very likely does, then the 2050 projections aren't describing a destination we're approaching linearly. They're describing the point at which AI-driven restructuring has had enough time to work its way through entire economies. The point where the gains stop being invisible in the macro data and start being undeniable. And we may be, right now, in the equivalent of 1900. Think about what that actually felt like from the inside. Picture someone in 1895. Not a factory worker. A skilled professional. A bookkeeper maybe. Or a draftsman. Someone who spent years learning technical drawing, who produced work that required genuine expertise, who was well compensated and respected for it. This person is not struggling. They are not on the margins. They have built a career on a foundation that has felt solid their entire working life. And somewhere in the background, electricity is spreading. Factories are getting motors. New companies are forming around new processes. But the productivity numbers don't show it yet. The economy doesn't feel different yet. The newspapers aren't running headlines about the end of skilled drafting or technical bookkeeping. Because in 1895, those headlines would have seemed absurd. The restructuring is happening. It's just happening underneath the surface of the data. In investment decisions. In infrastructure. In the quiet reorientation of entire industries around what the new technology makes possible. Nobody living inside that moment had the framework to see it clearly. Not the economists. Not the business owners. Not the skilled professionals whose roles were about to change beyond recognition over the next 30 years. Now come back to 2025. The AI investment numbers are historic. The infrastructure build-out is accelerating. The capability development is faster than anything the 1895 bookkeeper's world ever saw. And the productivity gains, the ones the headlines keep promising, haven't fully shown up in the macro data yet. Just like 1895. That's not reassuring. That's the thing nobody is saying loudly enough. The invisible phase of a restructuring is not the safe phase. It's the phase where the decisions that determine everything else get made quietly, by a relatively small number of actors, before most people have a framework to evaluate what's happening. We are in that phase right now. And 2050 is what comes out the other side of it. That reframes the entire conversation about AI's economic impact. But here's where it gets more specific, and more immediately relevant if you're making investment or policy decisions based on these projections. The 10% to 40% GDP contribution range isn't just wide because of adoption uncertainty. It's wide because it encodes a set of assumptions about geopolitics that most people reading the headline number never see. The 40% scenario assumes something that is looking increasingly fragile right now, a relatively integrated global AI development ecosystem. Shared infrastructure. Compatible regulatory frameworks. Cross-border data flows that allow AI systems to be trained and deployed at global scale. That is the optimistic scenario. And the incentive structure required to produce it is not currently in place. The 10% scenario assumes something closer to what's actually happening. AI development fragmenting along geopolitical lines. The US, EU, and China operating under fundamentally incompatible regulatory and strategic frameworks. Parallel AI ecosystems that don't interoperate. Significant duplication of infrastructure investment. And a global economy that captures only a fraction of the efficiency gains that a more integrated system would produce. Nobody's cleanly pricing in that downside yet. But the data supports it. Here is what that fragmentation already looks like in practice. The EU's AI Act classifies certain AI systems as high risk and requires specific conformity assessments before deployment. The United States has no equivalent federal requirement, which means a company building AI infrastructure that needs to operate across both markets is not building one system, it is building two. Different training data governance, different audit trails, different liability frameworks. That duplication of cost and complexity is not hypothetical. It is happening right now, inside every major technology company operating across the Atlantic. And it is happening before the regulatory divergence has even reached its mature form. By 2035, the cost of operating across incompatible AI governance regimes, in lost efficiency, duplicated infrastructure, and foregone cross-border data flows, is one of the most under-discussed line items in any serious 2050 economic forecast. The direction of global AI governance is not toward convergence. It's toward divergence. Different standards. Different priorities. Different definitions of what responsible AI even means. And that divergence has a direct economic cost that doesn't show up in the headline GDP projections, because those projections were mostly built before the current geopolitical fragmentation became this visible. So what does that mean for the 2050 number? It means the honest answer is that the range, 10% to 40%, is probably the most accurate thing any institution can tell you right now. Not because the modeling is weak, because the outcome genuinely depends on decisions that are still being made. By governments. By regulatory bodies. By companies choosing which standards to build to, and by international institutions trying to establish frameworks that sovereign states may or may not choose to follow. The data identifies the potential clearly. What it can't do is tell you which version of the future gets built. That question, who decides and how, leads us directly into the domain where the stakes are highest and the data is thinnest. Governance. And the gap between where AI regulation currently sits and where it needs to be by 2035 to meaningfully shape the 2050 outcome. So let's talk about governance. Because this is where the 10% versus 40% question actually gets decided. Not in the models. Not in the forecasts. In rooms. By specific institutions. With specific pressures on them. And the outcome is genuinely undecided right now. Here's where things actually stand. As of 2024, fewer than 30 countries have implemented any formal national AI regulatory framework. 30. Out of nearly 200 sovereign states. The EU AI Act, passed in 2024, is the most comprehensive binding regulation applied to AI systems anywhere in the world right now. And even that took years of negotiation, went through dozens of revisions, and still has significant implementation gaps regulators are actively working through. The United States operates primarily through executive orders and agency-level guidance, not comprehensive federal legislation. China has sector-specific AI regulations, but built around fundamentally different priorities than Western frameworks. And the rest of the world is largely watching and waiting. Now here's what makes that picture more than just concerning. Global AI legislative activity has more than doubled since 2022. So regulation is accelerating. That's real. But the pace of regulatory development still significantly lags the pace of AI capability development. And that gap isn't closing. If anything, it's widening. Think about what that means in practice for the 2050 number. The decisions being made right now, about data rights, about liability, about which AI systems are permitted in which contexts, are being made reactively. After deployment. After the systems are already embedded in infrastructure, in hiring pipelines, in financial models, in healthcare systems. Regulation that arrives after embedding is fundamentally weaker than regulation that shapes deployment from the start. Every governance researcher looking at this trajectory says the same thing. The window to shape AI's structural outcomes closes around 2035. After that, the dependencies are too deep, the lock-in too established, for policy to meaningfully redirect what market dynamics have already built. So who is actually making these decisions right now? The only body in the world currently making binding AI governance decisions, the EU's AI Office, established in 2024, has authority over one regulatory bloc. The institution attempting to coordinate global AI standards across member nations, the OECD's AI Policy Observatory, has no enforcement power whatsoever. The body responsible for AI safety research at the federal level in the United States, the National AI Safety Institute, operates purely in an advisory capacity with no binding authority over deployment decisions. And the regulator moving fastest of all, China's Cyberspace Administration, is building toward a framework that prioritizes state control over the open market standards every Western institution is simultaneously trying to establish. 4 bodies. 4 different mandates. 4 different definitions of what governing AI actually means. And not one of them has the authority, the resources, or the international mandate to determine what the 2050 outcome looks like on its own. None of these actors are operating from the same playbook. None of them have resolved the fundamental tension between moving fast enough to remain competitive and moving carefully enough to avoid locking in outcomes that are very difficult to reverse. And that tension leads directly to the finding that should be the closing thought of this entire section. The IMF's 2024 research established something that cuts through all the governance complexity and lands in a place that is genuinely hard to sit with. AI systems function as capital assets. They generate returns, without proportionally increasing the labor required to generate those returns. Which means that in the absence of deliberate structural intervention, taxation policy, education investment, social safety net redesign, labor market reform, AI does not distribute its gains. It concentrates them toward capital, away from labor, at a scale and speed that existing policy frameworks in every major economy are not currently built to counteract. That is not a prediction about what might happen. That is what the IMF's modeling says is the default outcome if the governance decisions between now and 2035 are not made deliberately and structurally. The data identifies that risk with complete clarity. What it cannot do is resolve it. Because resolving it is not an economics problem. It's a politics problem. And politics moves on a completely different timeline than technology does. Which brings us to the only honest conclusion this data actually supports. By 2050, AI will almost certainly represent one of the most consequential economic and social transitions in recorded history. The scale of what we've covered in this video, the GDP projections, the labor restructuring, the governance gap, the inequality dynamic, none of it is matched by any comparable technological transition in the modern era. Except arguably industrialization itself. And industrialization took a century to fully work through. AI is moving faster than that. But here's what we want to leave you with. And it goes back to where we started. Remember that Goldman Sachs report. The one with $7 trillion on one page and 300 million jobs exposed on the next. We said at the start that the tension between those two numbers is more revealing than either number alone. And after everything we've covered, that's still true. But now you have a framework to understand why. Those two numbers are not in conflict. They are a description of a fork. Both outcomes exist in the same future. They are not competing predictions. They are competing destinations inside the same transition, and which one a given person, a given economy, a given generation actually lands in, depends almost entirely on the structural decisions being made between now and 2035. The gap between the $7 trillion version of 2050 and the 300 million displaced version of 2050 is not inevitable. It is a choice. And for Marcus, and for everyone in a role structured like his, the most valuable thing this data offers is not reassurance. It is clarity. Clarity about which parts of the work are genuinely at risk, which parts are not, and what the window between now and 2035 actually means for the decisions worth making today. The difference between understanding that clearly and not understanding it at all is the difference between watching AI happen to you and having a framework to evaluate what's coming before it arrives. That is the real state of AI in 2050, according to the data we actually have. If this kind of analysis is what you've been looking for, no hype, no agenda, just the hardest data available broken down clearly, then Day After Tomorrow is built exactly for that. Every video on this channel starts where the headlines stop. We go deeper into the forecasts, the institutional research, and the structural forces shaping the world that's coming, faster than most people realize. Subscribe to Day After Tomorrow if you want to stay ahead of it. And if this video made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, that's exactly what we're here for. We'll see you in the next one.